Chapter 10. Blackguard Attempts the Worst. "Why didn't you tell us about the light?" Jeremy asked, turning to Plecky. "I didn't know it was important," answered Plecky. "In fact, I hardly even knew that there was a light. I thought nothing of it when you brought the torches. I just figured that you knew what you were doing. Now that I think of it, though, Judd said something about the light, too." "Well," said Jeremy, "I guess we've wasted enough time here. Let's get going." "Put out those torches," he called to everyone. "Now I realize they do more harm than good." Those who had torches extinguished them. As they did, the cavern began to glow, and all the shadows pointed back into the tunnel. Of the Nether Griffin, only Pudgy was brave enough to venture out of hiding, so they found a place for the little Nether Griffin in their long train of children. They marched out of the cavern and into the tunnel and followed the light back the way they had come. When they had been moving briskly for several minutes, the light directed them around several sharp turns. They were all confident, including Plucky, that they were now on the right path and that it would soon lead them to the castle. No sooner were they back on the right trail than they came upon a bubbling underground spring. It was already several yards across, and it looked as if it were growing quickly. They realized that if it continued, it would fill up the tunnel. Jeremy put out his arm, and the army came to a quick stop. As they stood there looking, the water began to creep up around their ankles. They moved back, but the water kept coming toward them. "There has never been any water in here before," said Plucky. "Well, there is now," said Jeremy, "and we'll either have to cross it or turn back." Turning to the children, he asked, "Are there any here who can't swim?" Almost half, mostly the younger ones, raised their hands. Jeremy sighed and stepped farther back as the water continued to rise. "I need 3 volunteers to try to cross this with me," he said. "We'll see how deep it is." First, Minnikin volunteered. Jeremy was about to object because of Minnikin's short stature, but Minnikin said, "Don't worry, Captain, I can swim like a fish." After that, several of the older boys stepped out and came to the front of the line. "Okay, Byron, I will need only one other besides you. Yes, you, Kirk, that will be fine. If we don't have any difficulty," he said to Don Maurice, "bring the others over as soon as we reach dry ground. We may have to really hurry the rest of the way if this water keeps rising." Jeremy and the other 3 with him stepped into the water. After they had taken just a few steps, they noticed that the water was no longer cold, but mildly warm. "Hey, this water isn't as cold as I thought it would be," exclaimed Byron. "In fact, it's getting rather hot," Kirk commented. The farther the 4 went, the hotter the water became. Instinctively, Don Maurice and the rest of the army kept backing away from the rising water. When the water began to steam, Don Maurice became frightened and called out to Jeremy. "Jeremy, come back! This must be one of Blackguard's tricks." "If it is, he will not get his own way," Jeremy said, setting his jaw against the pain of the hot water. Soon the water began to bubble, and a thick cloud of steam hid the 3 boys and Minnikin from the others' sight. All were silent now, and Don Maurice could hear the sound of their legs moving through the water. Suddenly there was a great splash, as if they had all fallen headlong into the boiling water. Don Maurice screamed out for Jeremy in horror, but no one answered. A fear-stricken murmur arose from the children. All stood stunned, unable to move. Then the steam began to clear. As it did, Don Maurice noticed that she could no longer see the edge of the pool. The steam cleared away a bit more, and she moved forward. The steam continued to disperse, revealing more and more of the cave's floor, but still she could not see the edge of the water. Then, only a few feet in front of her, as she edged forward, she saw 4 shapes. They looked like bodies. Yes, there they were. Jeremy and the others were sitting on the dry cave floor, looking about with dazed expressions on their faces. Jeremy looked up and saw Don Maurice. "What happened?" he asked. Don Maurice ran and threw her arms around her brother, tears filling her eyes. "Oh, I thought you had been sucked into that boiling water," she said. Then looking to the others, she asked, "Are you all right?" "Well, I'm all right," said Byron. "Me too, I think," spoke up Kirk. "Where did the water go?" Minnikin wondered aloud. "Even our clothes are dry." "I'm learning more and more about how this blackguard works," said Jeremy. "He's trying hard to keep us from reaching the king. This was just another sample of his treachery." "It seems that every time we go ahead, even though it seems impossible, his spell is broken," Damaris remarked. "This makes me all the more sure that we really can be some kind of help to the king. We will win this war!" Jeremy cried. All the children began to cheer. Singing as they went, they all continued to march along merrily. Plucky said that he was sure they would be there very soon. Everyone's spirits were high. Then the soft light that continually led the children illuminated a tall figure who stood motionlessly in the cave. "The king," Plucky whispered. The tall man saw them and ran toward them, turning both Jeremy and Damaris around with one sweep of his long arms. "Hurry," he said. "We must flee. The castle is overrun and the battle is lost." Damaris looked at him for a moment, stunned, and then burst into tears. They began to move slowly back the way they had come. But suddenly it went dark about them. "Wait!" shouted Jeremy. Instantly, everyone halted. "What's happening?" The cave began to grow light again. "Come, we must hurry," the king urged. "We fought hard, but we were weak from lack of food, and we were outnumbered 5-1. "What about Judd?" inquired Jeremy. "He must be dead by now," said the king in sorrowful tones. "Hurry, we haven't any time to lose. They must have seen me come in here. They'll be after me when they're done with the rest." "Do you mean to say that you don't know where Judd is or what's happened to him?" asked Jeremy. "I've got to go to the castle and find out. He may be hiding somewhere." "No," said the king. "We can't go back there. I just barely got away with my life." Jeremy determined to continue. "I can't ask the rest of you to come," said Jeremy, his face flushed red. "But I'm going after Judd." "I'm with you, Captain," said Minnikin. "I'm kind of fond of the little guy." It was a hard decision. Grandmother had taught them all so many things about the king, but they did have to think about Judd. Even if he was dead, they felt as if they should at least find out what happened to him. "I'm going with you," insisted Damaris, looking sadly at the king. She was so sorry that they had not gotten there in time. Soon all the others followed her example and chimed in. They all wanted to follow Jeremy and help him find poor little Judd. "I won't let you," said the king angrily. Jeremy's thoughts began to race as he stood facing the tall figure. How could this be the king that grandmother spoke of? A man of valor, fearless, kind, unselfish? How could he fear for his own life while his men are left dying behind him? Jeremy stood his ground. "I'm sorry, sire, but I and my army must go into battle." He knew he was no match for the king. Judd probably was dead, but he had to hope. But was there hope? The king would never have run if there had been a chance. Perhaps Isidore would simply stand aside. Hope. Jeremy again commanded his little army to move forward. As he did, the king drew his sword. Minnikin drew his small sword and stepped forward to defend his captain, but Jeremy reached out and took the sword, thinking that Minnikin was offering it to him. Before there was time to object, the duel began. Jeremy felt the sword become an extension of his own arm. He had never held one before. Someone else's skill flowed through his veins. The strength of another, a champion, surged within him. He felt himself move right and slash low at the king's left leg. The point slit cloth and flesh, only a slight wound, but enough to make both contestants serious, deadly serious. Jeremy felt his heart pounding in his throat. A doubt flashed through his mind. How could he be doing this, fighting the king he loved? But he was into it now. There was no undoing it. He put the thought out of his mind and yielded again to this new strength and talent. He felt a sensation not unlike warm oil pouring over his head and down his body. His mind relaxed while his body flexed for action. "So you have some talent then," growled the king between slashes of his sword. None of my own, I'm afraid, Jeremy returned. The king took up the offense again. He moved to the right, but the sword flew to his left hand. A quick inversion of hand brought Jeremy the split-second slice that warded off the blow. A righteous indignation rose up inside Jeremy. Why, he wondered, did he feel this way? With lightning-like quickness and hand to foot he moved now. He began to rely on speed and strength as they continued to prove themselves. He found he could read the king's movements now. He began to anticipate them. With the sword again in his right hand, the king circled left. Twice already he had feinted to the right and gone left, once switching hands. If he did it again, he would leave himself open in the upper body. Jeremy anticipated the move, almost as if in slow motion. This time he stepped back with his left foot and leaned back. As his left foot touched the ground, it was like a loaded spring. He shot forth, spinning left. His sword went over Isidore's lowered right arm and found its mark. Down went the king. He had only intended to defend himself. Now Jeremy stood dazed, mouth open. He had no intention of killing his king. No one cheered. No one spoke. As the body slumped and fell against the wall of the cave, an amazing thing began to take place. It was no longer the king who lay crumpled on the floor, but Blackguard the wizard. Just as quickly as it had changed, the body disappeared altogether, leaving everyone standing exactly as they had been when the fight ended. The horror that had filled Jeremy's heart when he thought he had killed the king now turned to elation when he realized that it was not the king at all, only the vilest of impostors. Some of the children began to laugh out loud. Others wept for joy. Still others jumped and cheered and danced and sang. Now we don't need to wonder what is real and what is not, Jeremy said, smiling. Hope has conquered the last illusion. The rest of the way through the mountain seemed very short to the light-hearted children. They felt as if the whole victory had already been won. The tiredness left them, and they reached the opening of the cave near the stable with no more delays. Their excitement was short-lived. They found they could not reach the castle itself. Terps surrounded all sides. Jeremy decided to send Plucky to tell Judd and the king that they had arrived. Meanwhile, they settled down quietly in the cave to wait for Plucky's return and for orders from the king. By this time, the sun had gone down behind the hills, though there was still enough light to see by. This was the second night since they had met in the old church. What a lot had happened in only 2 days. They all stayed well back from the mouth of the cave while they rested and waited. Only the lookout stayed in the opening to watch for trouble and for Plucky's return. Jeremy had been with the lookout and was just going back to the group when he heard a murmur arise and saw a group of children all crowding together around Pudgy. This stuff is good," someone said. "It sure is, and I was hungry too," said another. "It seems to quench your thirst as well," came Domaris's voice out of the middle of the huddle. "Amazing." Jeremy inched his way past all the crowded little bodies until he stood next to his sister. "What is this all about?" he demanded. He feared that the enemy might hear the commotion and discover them. "It's the moss, Jeremy. Taste it," she said. "Oh, go ahead," reducing her voice to a whisper when she saw Jeremy's concerned look. "Plucky told us that the moss was good to eat," she continued. "He says it's very rare and only grows in this one mountain. This is the most he's seen in one place, though. I would never have thought to taste it. Isn't it wonderful stuff, Jeremy?" She picked a handful of the deep green-colored moss and dropped it into Jeremy's hand. He knit his brow together as he looked down at it, suspicious at first. But his heart felt no fear, even though he searched carefully within himself. He lifted the moss slowly to his mouth, but he kept his eyes open, watching the soft light that still glowed about them. It had warned him about Blackguard, and he could trust it now. There was not the slightest change in the light, so he ate the moss. It was indeed refreshing. He had been trying to forget the deep hunger he felt, but just one handful of the moss satisfied him completely. It wasn't the least bit slimy, as you might expect. Rather, it was firm, crisp, and a little tart. It so quenched Jeremy's thirst that he thought he might never be thirsty again. "I've never tasted anything quite like it," Jeremy said distantly. His thoughts had turned to grandmother, the soft light, the moss, and even Plucky and Pudgy. He had a sudden feeling that nothing in his life had ever been completely accidental. Each one of the children finished eating his handful of moss. No one had desire for more. Then they lay down on the floor of the cave and began to fall asleep. The cave floor was much more comfortable than you might expect because the moss grew thick on the floor as well as on the walls and ceiling. They had not noticed the moss in other parts of the tunnel, but here, not far from the entrance, it grew in abundance.